screen. And we're now ready to begin our panel discussion. I'd like to introduce Ed Amoroso, CEO of TAG Cyber, who will kick us off. Ed?
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate you setting us all up. So I've been friends with Ken File from TechDemocracy for some time. And he called and said, why don't we set up a discussion around communicating with boards? And I said, man, it's a great topic, something I've been interested in. And some number of months ago, I'd been asked to sort of pen out a list of some questions. And I happened to connect up with Andy Geis, who was one of the senior leaders over at AT&T, basically ran the whole business over there. And we were sort of comparing notes. Andy was doing something similar. And I was so happy Andy was willing to go help me out with some notes on communicating with boards. And, we published it out on social media. It worked out pretty well. So we got a nice group of folks here. Andy's Max Thompson, who is an attorney over at Murphy & McGonigal here in New York City. And, of course, Ken. So I'm going to give each of the guys a minute or so just to introduce themselves to each of you. And then we're going to go through some topics here in terms of cyber risk. Listen carefully, because I think you'll get some good advice from the guys here on both sides of the table. That, like, if you're on the executive side, I think you'll hear some points, and Andy's on both sides of that table. You'll get some advice on maybe how to listen for different types of issues as someone's reporting risk to you. And then back to the side of the table that I know a lot of you are more familiar with, where you're reporting risk, you're explaining, you're trying to communicate with an executive team the problems or the potential problems that might exist in your cybersecurity infrastructure. You'll hopefully get one or two ideas there. That's the whole point of our next hour, to hopefully share with you at least one or two ideas that you can use in your day-to-day work. So that's why we're here. I'm glad you all made a little time for this, and we'll do everything we can to make this a useful conversation. I'll also remind you, I think you heard a minute ago from Mike, if you can just make sure you hang out on mute. So if you can just double check, make sure you're on mute. That'll make for a cleaner call. We'll be able to hear each of the speakers nice and clearly. So I'm going to start by asking Andy Geis if he'll take a minute and just share a little bit about himself, and then Andy, maybe you can turn it over to Max at that point.
Sure. Thank you, Ed, and thanks for having me, to you and Ken. Looking forward to this. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm now an operating partner at Bessemer Venture Partners, which is a VC firm out of New York and California. Before that, I was CEO of AT&T Business, as Ed pointed out, running, which was about 2/3 of the business. And before that, I also had consumer, which was basically the wireline piece. So in both of those roles, cybersecurity was a big issue. And prior to that, I was CIO of AT&T. And prior to that, I headed up all the software. So looking forward to this topic. It's something that frankly is discussed on every board that I'm on, and is a major topic now at the board level, which it didn't used to be. So it'll be an interesting discussion. And let me introduce Max. Max, if you'd like to go next.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Max Thompson. I'm an attorney at Murphy & McGonigal. Prior to joining Murphy, I was an assistant general counsel at Bank Leumi USA, and also an assistant corporate secretary there. In that role, I dealt significantly with the bank's cybersecurity, its compliance requirements and best practices, and also had significant experience dealing with our board. And of course, those two experiences were coupled together at several instances. Prior to joining Bank Leumi, I was in the Office of General Counsel at the New York State Department of Financial Services. And among many other things, I was also one of the principal drafters of Part 500, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, especially those in the financial services industry. Really looking forward to this panel. In my experience, cybersecurity and data privacy is becoming a top topic on the minds of many directors. So this is certainly topical.
Very good. Okay, Ken, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ken File. Some of you, it's such a small world that I probably run into most of you or all of you at one point. It's kind of funny. It's with this industry, it's we kind of say it's, everyone knows each other at some point or another. I've been doing CyberSecurity, as it's called now. The artist formerly known as information security. And when they first changed that term, I kind of threw up in my mouth a little bit every time I heard it. Face it, and you guys probably did too. But I've been primarily a chief security officer for 17 or 18 years before signing on with TechDemocracy to kind of create this platform. Now I'm chief security architect for the Intellectual platform. My background goes probably back to the late 80s, early 90s. I've written or co-written probably about 8 books on the subject. Some of them are used at RIT and MIT as textbooks now. So been doing this for quite a bit, just like you all.
Well, thanks, Ken. That's excellent. I appreciate the intros, Andy, Max, and Ken. So let's start in with the topic of cyber risk, and in particular, common frameworks for discussing risk. And Andy, I want to start with you. You sit on a bunch of different boards. You deal with a lot of different companies. Probably do that as much as anybody I know. And I'm going to guess that when you hear high risk in one context, it might mean something totally different in a different context. Somebody might say, "Oh, it's not that big a deal; it's a low risk." Another might say, "Oh my gosh, it's a high risk," and it's all. How do you deal with the fact that establishing sort of a common language or framework has been kind of difficult? It's not easy to communicate because everybody kind of has their own language and definitions. Any thoughts on that, Andy?
And that's a very good question, and you are right. It varies significantly by board. Some boards are much more aware of the risk to them and their brand, to their business continuity, and some aren't aware at all and view it as almost, frankly, an afterthought. So one of the first things, at least in every board I've been in, that we tried to do is, normally this falls under the audit committee, and the audit committee is basically usually a bunch of financial people, and they understand risk and business risk, but not necessarily cybersecurity risk. So one of the first things to try to do, and been successful in it in most of the boards I've been on, is raise cybersecurity as a main risk of the board that the board should look at and should manage. And in places where we've been successful to do that, in other words, split it out of the audit committee, or at least make it a subcommittee of the audit committee so that there's a real focus on it with the CISO. When you do that, the first thing you find is what you said, that nobody knows how to communicate with each other. Nobody really understands the risk. And it's extremely important to get a common framework. I'll use words that you and I talked about when we were at AT&T, when you once said to me, just pick a framework when I was CIO, and let's follow that framework, something we can create a common set of language around, something we can audit, and basically rate ourselves against. So I guess the easy answer to your question is there is no real common language or framework, so it's important for the CISO to pick one and then stick to that and put that in their culture and create something that they can then audit against.
So as long as there's maybe some consistency in a given company, then it can be forgiven that maybe between companies the discussion might be a little different. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I don't think it has to be the same in every company, but I think there's a lot of good frameworks out there. And getting the CISO and, frankly, the audit committee to understand which one we're going to follow and which one we're going to make sure we know where we have holes plugged or aren't plugged is critical. You got to have something that you can audit and know where you really stand, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Andy, if I could...
Go ahead.
I just want to add, I think that's exactly right. Consistency is key, and to keep in mind, the cyber risk is going to be specific to the entity in question. So if a director or anyone, an executive, goes out and has discussions with individuals from another company, they might be speaking a different language because the risks that you're concerned with should be specific to your company, and the language should be specific to your company. So you should be consistent within your organization, but understand that some other frameworks exist, and you might have different conversations with different people from different organizations.
I agree with that completely. But yeah, I think that, one very important aspect that a lot of folks overlook is that those variables in that pitch and that tone are going to be inconsistent in a lot of organizations. Like, one board is not going to think, about risk the same way, no matter how you interpret it. Case in point, I work for a holding company of a financial company. We had operations in 28 countries. We had about 24 independent legal operating entities, and out of that, we had about 20 boards of directors. So, I was lucky that in a lot of the cases, a lot of the board members were the same from board to board. But in a truly global and international organization, you have different standards that you have to relate to, per Max's point, but you also have to adjust, your message to allow for a different interpretation and anticipate that interpretation. And I think a lot of people overlook that.
Ken, let's stick on that point for a minute. So this idea of common interpretation. If I'm a regulator or if I'm an external auditor or assessor, at some point I have to connect the dots between what you're saying and some general notion of best practices. I know, TechDemocracy, you guys deal with a lot of clients who have that issue. Do you see that? Like, again, if I work for the Fed and I deal with Bank A, and to Andy's point, they have a nice, consistent view of what their risk is, but then I go to Bank B, they may have something consistent with totally different scale. Does that auditor or does that external person have to somehow do a translation or something?
No, absolutely. And in order to do that effectively across, different standards, different regulatory aspects, you first have to break it down in your mind, in your own mind, to, the most common denominator, all right? And speak to that most common denominator, but then elaborate on the areas of concern that either, the audit committee is going to focus on or things of that nature. So I think if your message is consistent, and Andy had a great point, is that most boards and most boards they're taught something in business school, right? So you learn, various aspects of risk that they teach you in business school. You learn credit market risk, reputational risk, operational risk. You don't learn cyber risk. That's something that, that comes with experience and exposure. But if you're not helping, the board members with the exposure and speaking to them, I'm not saying, go and completely dumb it down, but try and talk more like an area of business rather than an area of technology.
Well, let's take that topic and let me ask all three of you. Maybe we'll start with Andy. Do you think it makes sense to do that translation? Like, a lot of times I'll go to these seminars. I joined the board of a large bank, spent some time there and did a little training. And I listened as the trainer said, the best way to communicate with boards is to put things into business language. And they use cyber as the example. Like, if you're going to describe a cyber issue, then talk in the language of the board. And I thought, how the heck do you do that? If I'm describing a potential vulnerability that exists somewhere, I don't always know how to translate that into money. Andy, do you think that's kind of nuts to try to do that? Maybe the board should just try and understand the technology, or is there some merit maybe to talking in business language?
I definitely think there's merit in talking in business language, and I'll give you kind of a before and after picture, Ed. When I was on boards in the early 90s, frankly, and the cybersecurity wasn't even talked about. People didn't understand it. Boards didn't really even care. There wasn't a focus there. When the Sony, and there were several others, but when the Sony hack hit, and it basically brought them down to their knees. And since then, we all know many others, Target and Equifax and et cetera. Boards started standing up and paying attention. But they thought about it, and still, at least the ones I've been on, and still think about it in terms of risk. They think of it in terms of reputation risk, business continuity risk, in terms of, the future viability of the company in Sony's case, and Equifax both. I mean, they were on the edge there for a while. So I think a CISO that can communicate it in terms of risk to the business, first and foremost, gets the board's attention. Now, does the board have to start to delve into it to understand at least part of the technology? I would personally vote yes for that. It's one of the reasons I try to push for a cybersecurity subcommittee of the board. I think way too much cybersecurity is in the audit committee, and they're only looking, frankly, for the most part, at risk and don't really understand the technology. And the reason I say the boards need to start to learn a little bit about it, they need to know enough to ask the CISO if they're plugging the holes for what the potential risks are. That make sense?
I think it does. So the essence of it is really being able to ask questions that are meaningful. And I think you make the point that we should be talking in business language, but there's a little bit of an obligation for them to be able to at least speak intelligently. I don't think we can get past the board members to be complete Luddites anymore.
Yeah. I agree with that. I'd add one more thing, and that is, at least what I do mainly in the enterprise world, things are changing now, and more of the products themselves are software-based. And so it's becoming an obligation of the board, I think, and the company executives to truly start to understand this area and making sure that they're covered, because it's their business at risk.
Yeah. Hey,
And
Max,
actually,
go ahead. Max, I was going to ask you about lawyers, but Ken chiming in. Go ahead, Ken, and then we'll get
just a point to add. I mean, I had done some research, in preparation for this panel, and I found an Accenture study that said from 2016, only 6% of directors at the world's largest financial institutions had technology expertise. So there's clearly a knowledge gap, but I don't think it is entirely incumbent upon the CISO or any of their underlings to be the ones that have all the responsibility in communicating this information. The directors do have a responsibility to try and learn this information. So it's a compromise. There's definitely a middle ground that needs to be reached by both sides in order to make sure all the information is being communicated properly.
Yeah. Max, how do the lawyers do when you're dealing with in your own legal firm, and also when you're dealing with other attorneys? I'm sure that this topic comes up frequently. What letter grade would you give to the legal community in terms of their ability to communicate risk and maybe have intelligent discussions about cybersecurity?
Well, I would say in the legal community, it's a new frontier for lawyers as well, because it's only been recently that significant cybersecurity regulations have been coming out, and rules like GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act. These are all new rules, and that's why it's making the conversation easier. It's easier to have a conversation with your clients about the importance of these issues when you can point to a law and say, you're required to do this, and if you don't, you could face significant penalties or sanctions. It used to be much more difficult, but now with the power of the law behind us, it becomes a little bit easier. That being said, I think lawyers, including myself, still have a lot to learn about the space, about the rules that are going to be developing, and how to effectively counsel a client within that framework.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, Ken, does a platform help here? Like if people buy a tool like this that you guys provide your customers, your platform, does that help at all with kind of stuff?
It helps enormously, I think, and that's the primary reason I kind of left being a CISO to kind of take this job at TechDemocracy, is to design a platform that makes it easier to kind of convey technical risk into business terms. And the one thing that most boards and most executives understand is financial risk. So if you can translate fairly easily all the aspects of technical risk, and not just from from the IT side of the house, but you've got risks that are induced from KYC and AML and things like that, and equate that into the overall risk picture. It just makes presenting that that much easier. I mean, before the days of security dashboards and automation and everything else, I mean, we were doing this stuff in Excel spreadsheets and pie charts and and garbage like that, and that was just a real task and a real chore. I spoke about doing the whole whole worldwide trip, right? Just 2013, I spent pretty much most of the year on a plane, going around with score sheets, talking to boards and around the globe. So, some sort of a framework that translates well and translates technical risk into business risk is you can't put a value on that.
Let's stay with you, Ken. You mentioned score sheets. I want to bring up a topic and see what you think. When I was sitting on the other side, as a board member, I remember if there was a letter that came, say, from the Fed that had 3 or 4 or 6 or 10 deficiencies, then suddenly that thing would take on a life of its own in the board. Like that would become, quote unquote, the letter, and you'd talk about it at every meeting. And the CISO would come in and say, well, we had 6 items in the letter, and now we have 4 items, and now we have 2, and everybody would sort of count down to dealing with the Fed's issues. I always felt like that became sort of the de facto risk framework, just some letter from external groups. Do you see that, and do you think we run the risk in some boards of being sort of having the risk program dictated by either a regulatory or some sort of a business audit?
Yeah, traditionally in the past, and as we kind of mentioned, and Andy mentioned previously, about cyber risk being relatively new. I've been reporting to boards for 13 years, and I haven't really seen it become a focus or an area that was really interesting to the board, except for maybe the last 6 years. And every year, it kind of moves further and further toward the front. And the way that it's been done in the past was, like you said, how many audit points do I have outstanding? How many have I closed? Because the reasoning is they understand the regulatory risk behind that, right? But if you're presenting your entire program, your entire security program, and saying, all right, this is your estimated financial risk for the information security program. And let's say, I used to get probably the same 10 to 15 questions every single time, any board that I went in front of, and they were, are we investing wisely? How are we doing in relation to our competitors? Because board members talk to each other, right, Andy? You may be a member of, this board, but that board member, downstream of the other company. So they talk to each other. And another one that I used to get asked a lot is, how can we most effectively shore up and future accelerate, your information security program? Are we rectifying, difficulties? What is, our regulatory risk? Those are all, the same questions that, we've, at least with Intellecta, we've tried to operationalize and just kind of make it a red, yellow, and green type, one click. But here's the data that supports that.
Yeah, I want to ask Max a little bit about kind of the legal fiduciary responsibility that boards have, and whether, Max, you think it kind of changes the equation a little bit. It's one thing if you're a supervisor listening to someone on your team communicate risk. It's another if you've got this legal responsibility. How do you see that playing, and what have you seen in your own practice in terms of how board members take that kind of personally and might take some personal risk if they don't do things right? What's been your observation there?
That's absolutely right. I mean, now that there are rules coming out that certainly either explicitly require board involvement or implicitly, just given the nature of the overhaul that will be required of the company, directors are starting to pay attention because they realize now that their oversight plays a role. So, for example, those of you that are subject to DFS Part 500, the board has to receive an annual written report from its CISO. And it's not simply a check-the-box mechanism. It's something that they have to do every year. And then also file a certification, and that certification can be signed by a senior officer, but a board can sign it too. And if a board's putting its name on a certification that they're compliant with its cybersecurity requirements, that heightens the level of risk for the director individually, and they're going to be paying attention. And for other rules, like GDPR, for example, most companies that are subject to it are going to be going through such a significant overhaul of their policies and procedures that the board needs to be involved, and if it's not, I'd say it's negligent. So the responsibility is growing, and I think directors are really starting to feel that.
That's a great answer. You know, Andy, I want to ask you a question that I had relayed to me that I couldn't answer. I've been kind of doing some board training recently. I had a guy come up to me, and he asked the following. Tell me what you think about this. He was asking kind of about Target and Sony and all these companies that had gotten hacked, and said more or less, almost cynically, well, yeah, they got hacked, but, you know, stock kind of bounced back. A couple people got fired. Kind of what's really the difference. And I have to admit that I felt very flat-footed in my response. I didn't have a good response. I was sort of like, well, you know, I think you used the word teetering earlier, and I would agree. That's how I would describe it. But do you hear that, like, from other board members or other executives or folks at Bessemer, where they'll say, well, you know, it's important, but who's really ever suffered on this? How would you answer a question like that?
No, you know, without being too obnoxious, I would say that's somebody who's pretty foolish. I've never heard that in any of the boards I've been on, just the opposite. The discussion, well, I can give you some, well, I can't tell you the company names, obviously it's confidential, but the discussions around Target were pretty horrendous because not only did a lot of management lose their jobs, including the CEO and CIO, who I knew both, and the board was under a lot of pressure because there was a major impact to their shareholder price, to their sales, to their reputation, and to their brand. And it took a pretty big hit for, I would say, a couple of years before they totally bounced back. And, you know, can companies bounce back from those things? Sure. So is that person right in the sense that they can? Yes. But it's not a guaranteed thing by any means. I'm still not sure. I don't know. You may know better than me or Ken, but I'm still not sure Equifax is going to totally bounce back. And, you know, I have not heard that, and I think it's a rather foolish thought, frankly.
Something I think that's brought up in the context of Home Depot and Target and others where, and it's usually this cynical thing like, well, you know, I drive by the parking lot at my local Home Depot and they sure look busy. I'm guessing they're okay. And it's usually somebody who's making an argument that people like me are making too big a deal of the cyber risk equations. So it's a tough one. Max, have you ever encountered any pushback, either at the executive or board level, where they think maybe we're making a little too big a deal around the cyber risk thing? Have you ever had that come up?
I think right now the fear is inciting enough motivation to do something. But there is a crowd of people, certainly some directors I've spoken with, that take the position that if there's a breach, the company is actually a victim, right? Just as much as the people whose information was let go. Now, there's some arguments that might be true depending on the circumstances. Of course, if the company was wholly negligent in their cyber compliance and requirements, that's not really the case. But some directors have taken that approach that we feel victimized, we've been attacked, our information is let go, we have a good program. So they might feel, it's that's not a big deal, but they're just as vulnerable as everyone whose information is being lost.
Well, what's the state of some of the lawsuits that you guys might be seeing? Are there some active legal engagements, lawsuits that are pending, or other legal action that maybe we'll be reading about in the future?
Well, I'll tell you, just about, yeah, sure. I mean, you've all seen the Marriott hack that just happened, and that was ongoing for several years. And it seems as soon as the breach is announced, litigation is filed almost immediately. Classes are certified relatively quickly because there's so many people affected. It's an easy grab for a plaintiff's firm that's looking to take on the company. And from there, it's fact specific. They'll do a deep dive on whether the company was negligent or whether they had good posture. So it can really vary. But we see pretty frequently when a company announces a breach, lawsuits are filed almost immediately.
And Ken, I don't want to make this into some marketing thing, but I'm guessing, and tell me if I'm reading this right. when somebody does have a breach and they get sued, it's probably the case that at some point some lawyer is trying to establish that you were not following industry best practice and that you were negligent. Again, is that kind of an argument for some automation and maybe having some regularity and work, sort of monitored workflow around how you manage risk? Am I reading that right?
Well, from my viewpoint, I think most CSOs kind of have a handle on that, at least in their own mind. But, again, being able to kind of present that in a way that's going to, kind of get them off the hook. I think this, Max, this is probably more along up your alley.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, this is an issue that's spurring a lot of litigation. There's a lot of legal risk here. Boards need to be mindful of it. The results will depend on the circumstances at issue, but we've been seeing a lot of it, and it's undoubtedly likely to continue.
All right, let's go to an adjacent topic now. We have a few minutes to cover, and that's compliance versus security. One of my personal challenges has been, in my own work, helping executives understand the difference between showing that you've got worked through a checklist and you do the basics versus, doing an effective and active cyber mitigation program. The two are kind of different. Andy, you deal with a lot of companies, both startups and big companies, and you ran this big monster organization and so on. How do executives, in your mind, kind of get the difference between, a compliance and establishing like ISO or NIST or something like that, where you can say I met these, or PCI, and really having a good active cybersecurity program interwoven with your IT team and the CIO on board and all that stuff? Do you think people get that, or are they getting that more now, do you think?
It's a good question. And the honest answer from my viewpoint is it's all over the map. And, in the startup world, it seems to be the least, they aren't spending a lot of time talking about it. However, that is changing. I'm on several startups now boards where their main business is data. And as a board, we've brought up numerous times, you don't have a business if that data isn't secure. So they're starting to understand they need both a compliance program as well as a security organization to make sure they are compliant. And so, but I would say it's a struggle, in most of these boards to get that focus. And the reason is they're so focused on the business itself, on the financials, and where the next set of funding is going to come, even in some of these public companies I've been on the board of, that getting them to focus on both the compliance piece of the program as well as the mitigation is an effort. It's something you have to push. And frankly, the chairman and the CEO have to understand why it's so critical and start to push it. I'll leave it with a story. One public company I was on the board of, it really took myself, who understood and I've been heavily involved in cyber programs most of my career, and the guy that was head of the audit committee, to really convince the CEO, and Ed, you actually helped, we shouldn't say the company, but you actually helped me with this, convince the CEO that he really needs a CISO, he really needs a compliance program, and framework is a better way to say it, and then a program around that to mitigate those risks. And it took a lot of effort to really convince him, and this was a technology exec. So
yeah.
I think we got a hill to climb here, frankly, in making sure boards understand. And I think, as bad as they've been, some of these high-profile hacks have actually been good in getting boards' attention.
Yeah, never waste a good crisis, right?
Exactly.
Right. Hey, Max.
And actually,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just one suggestion I've seen actually worked really well. If you're having trouble kind of communicating the importance to the board, you can actually start involving them in some ways. If you're doing tabletop exercises, especially those that are more geared to the non-security personnel you have at your entity, or even if you're doing a phishing exercise and you want to put one of your directors on that list and see if they click the link, it's a great way to show them that you're making the effort. They then get involved and can kind of get that hands-on experience, and it might spur them to be, pay a little bit more attention.
We actually did that to the chairman and CEO with a spear phishing attempt. It was part of our every other month exercise. And in the past, we had been instructed to leave the board members alone and leave the executives alone because they were a little too gullible, and it kind of made them look bad.
Sure.
But we went ahead anyway, and
you make the point.
We crafted a wonderful little Amazon email saying that your purchase was successful for this 75-inch screen TV, and he got on the phone immediately and railed out his wife, like immediately.
Maybe that's why they didn't want you putting him up.
But the counter to that is he uses that as a teaching experience to the rest of the board now. And he's like, yeah, I remember when you guys got me, and if there's somebody new in the room, he'll tell the story, and
that's exactly right.
And their ears perk up.
Let me ask you guys about, I get the phishing thing, and I do think there's quite a bit of value in that. But let's talk the war game exercise. I'll be perfectly honest, I've been an old grouchy curmudgeon about that kind of thing. I've seen a lot of really bad kind of tabletop exercises. I remember Secretary Chertoff asking if I would participate in something like that, and I didn't want to do it because it just sounded... This is just me, personal bias. I've seen them done very poorly. Ken, let's start with you. You guys have some clients that get you guys engaged in that. Am I reading it wrong? Are these like tabletop exercises, say, with executives and boards? Have you found them valuable? And I may very well be wrong in my little curmudgeon view here. What do you think?
I've actually found the tabletop exercises to be very valuable from the coordination aspect, because when especially with incident response plans and testing them and how you're going to value and how you're going to react to kind of mitigate something. One of probably the most beneficial, if you want to call it a tabletop exercise, was put on by SIFMA called Quantum Dawn. And there were probably well over 100 financial institutions that took place in it. But just the coordination, the internal coordination, and this really got the other folks, because you've got involvement from HR, you've got involvement from marketing, legal, compliance, all aspects in all areas and operating areas of the company. And kind of, let's say if you've got, a business continuity crisis, it's pretty much cut and dry, right? You're going to try and, do a return to business as soon as humanly possible. But if you've got an incident, an actual security incident that could cause undue or extensive reputational risk, and most board members are really, really concerned about reputational risk. It's not just the company's reputation, it's not just the shareholder value, but it's also their personal reputations on the line. So if you've got that type of, coordination going on internally, great. If not, you really need to kind of take stock and look at that side.
Yeah. Andy, have you ever sat through one of these tabletops that you thought was good? Like I said, I've sat through some bad ones. I've even run some bad ones. But what's been your experience there? When they're done properly, can they be effective?
Yes, it's funny you bring it up because when I was head of software and even as CIO, I used to absolutely hate those. As you know, there are a lot of effort to put on and a lot of time and trouble. But I'll be the first to admit that Ken's exactly right. I mean, almost every time we did it, we found some sort of hole we had to go back and rethink and plug. And it was generally coordination between many, many different groups. And so it's in the company that you helped me with, Ed, where it was a public company, I actually pushed them thinking through, you need to start doing tabletop exercises because they really had never experienced a really bad hack, a real bad issue, and forcing to understand how they would communicate not just internally to plug those problems, but externally. And guess what? Within about a month, they had somebody get into some of their AWS data that caused, real notification, real issues, and the tabletop exercise was absolutely key in making sure that we had the right processes in place. I know they're a pain. I know they're hard to do. I know they take a lot of time and effort, and I know things get out of date very quickly. But it does do exactly what Ken said. It helps you make sure your organization is communicating well.
Yeah, makes sense. Max, any thoughts on the live exercise kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've seen two different categories. I've sat in on those that were geared towards an InfoSec team, and those are very heavy. The team understands what's happening, and they are a little more on the dry side, but they're good for them because it gets them in a room and understand what the company's situation is and how it can react. And I've seen the others where they're more for laymen, I would say. I think some vendors provide these, maybe PwC is one of them, and they can be fun. They're more of a game, and you can actually pit teams against each other, one being the quote-unquote hackers and the other being the company, and they see who does better. But at the end of it, if let's say the company loses, you could point to the director that's sitting on that team and say, yes, this was fun, but if this were a real situation, you just lost all the information of 20 million of our customers. And all of a sudden, it kind of brings that realization to them, like, if this was a real situation, we need to be better prepared.
Yeah, makes sense. So, well, let's shift gears into governance and management and organization. One of the key roles for a board is to oversee how the company is managed. Do you have the right positions? Do you have the right people? Does the CEO have the right team sitting around the table? And let me preface by saying that I think if you look back at the way human resources as a function in a corporation has evolved, I know I went back and looked. I looked at Alfred Sloan's book, My Years in General Motors, and I saw that he put org charts in the book. So for 1930, 40, 50, and 60, you can see General Motors organization charts, and there's no evidence of a personnel function prior to World War II. After World War II, it kind of shows up. And then each decade, it seemed to be elevated to the point where now, I'll bet Andy and others probably have never dealt with a large company that didn't have an HR executive reporting directly to the CEO. So it's a clear progression from two people typing up badges to one of the senior most executives that every corporation would view as essential in terms of direct report to the CEO. Ken, let's start with you, and we'll work our way back to Max and then over to Andy, who I know has some thoughts on this. But Ken, what's been your experience? Have you ever worked with a company that is either in the process or has already made the decision to have a InfoSec or information risk or cybersecurity executive, literally reporting to the CEO, or do you generally see them buried a little bit further down in the organization? What's been your experience?
Unfortunately, in most companies and in most cases, you see it buried a little bit further down in the organization. You see it buried somewhere in technology because, and I think we're talking about the topic that is, the most pain in the butt. To kind of get through and break through that barrier to getting folks to understand that a security executive is or a true security executive can also speak in terms of business. I've been fortunate enough in past roles to have reported into different governance structures. Like I've reported to the CEO and the board of directors. In the case of Capital IQ, which was bought by Standard & Poor's. So I was on, parallel with the highest ranking technology executive, and we had a great working relationship. He was the one that lobbied for my hire, as a matter of fact. And I've also worked for some great, CIOs/CTOs, but I've also worked for a few duds. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I've reported to a chief financial officer. I've reported to the chief operating officer at when I was at this other mutual fund, well, actually both mutual funds here in Boston. So, I think the effectiveness is going to rely a lot on the individual, and I think an individual, I mean, the security executive, their effectiveness to communicate in terms that their boss understands, right? Because their boss 9 times out of 10 is also going to be standing there in front of the board and trying to defend the program and how they're managing you. So in a lot of cases, that could be construed as some type of direct assault on their management skills if you're not doing the right thing or you're not communicating effectively with them, right?
I think that makes good sense. Max, what are you seeing? And do you see CISOs and CSOs sometimes reporting up through maybe the lead counsel or CFO or other places, or do you also see the position in many cases kind of embedded into the technology organization? What's been your experience?
I think Ken's experience is pretty true in that, most companies will take a different approach. I have seen it buried before, usually right under the CTO or a CIO, and then right from there to the CEO. So it's not a significant gap. But like Ken said, that management relationship, the effectiveness will really depend on the people involved. If you have a CISO that's reporting to a CIO, and the CIO cares very deeply about cybersecurity and is an effective communicator, that one step removed shouldn't be an issue. But sometimes it can be. If the CISO is too far down and too far removed from the CEO, it almost kind of creates this idea that maybe it's not as important. I think going forward, we'll begin to see a change where more CISOs are reporting directly to the CEO and perhaps even directly to the board. And on that point, I would note, a lot of boards have a dedicated committee or are starting to create a dedicated committee, either for technology or IT or cyber. And it's great if the CISO is getting in front of that committee on a regular basis. But it's important for the CISO to get in front of the full board as well and to impress upon the company that this is an important topic. It shouldn't be limited to a committee of people that understand the technology a little better. The full board needs to be apprised as well.
It was my experience in banking that it was a very big deal to establish even a subcommittee. Like I remember the board secretary, obviously you guys know me, I was like, well, let's set up a subcommittee, let's blah, 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 do cyber. And the best I could do was to get sort of a breakfast club. It was like, there was no administration around that, no reporting required. It seemed like it was a big deal, literally from the board secretary's perspective, that there was a lot of administrative and legal overhead to doing something like that. Does that sound right, Max?
There could be. Yeah, I think cost is kind of that's a bad excuse. Really, saying something is too expensive or maybe too time consuming, I really do think cyber risk is important enough to put that effort in. And it's funny as you bring this up, I was just reading the House report on Equifax. It just came out, I believe it was yesterday, a couple of days ago. One of the remediation efforts that Equifax is going to do is have a more robust subcommittee for cybersecurity because they had not had one before. So I assume most of those banks or any bank or any company that says, I don't know if it's worth the effort, they took a look at that Equifax report, they might think otherwise.
That's a good point. So, well, Andy, I'm interested to see what you think. If you were the lead architect organizationally for a very large company and you were kind of setting things up optimally, where would you tend to put cybersecurity? Would you put it under the CIO? Would you put it equal? Would you put it over in some other group? What do you think is the best setup, or is there no one equation for every company?
Yeah, I don't think there's one equation. I think it depends greatly on the business they're in and what their main business is. I think there's very few CEOs that I know of that want to deal with it directly or have anything to do with it, except to know that it's there and it works well and they're secure, and that they aren't going to have an issue or a problem. With that said, I think that to answer your question, if I was designing it from scratch, in most shops that I see it, it's buried further down than even the CIO. And for sure, I think it should be at least reporting to the CIO at that level. Most CIOs, not all, but most CIOs now work either for the CEO or close to the CEO. But I do think, and this is where I think you're right on this, I do think it's important for the board to start forming subcommittees that looks at cyber security risk, because the potential risk to the business itself, to business continuity, to the reputation, to stock price, to employees wanting to work there, the list goes on, is huge. And that should be something the CEO and the board should be interested in. And absent the CEO really wanting to manage it day in, day out, I personally think getting it at that level, at the board level, makes sense. With that said, almost every board, let's be clear here, almost every board I've been on, cybersecurity is an afterthought. They expect this audit committee to do it. When the audit committee looks at it, it's a very small part of their meetings. It's more of what you said earlier, a checklist. Have we hit this? Have we hit that? What kind of risk do we really have?
Yeah.
And so I do think it's going to change over time. And there's a bunch of reasons it's changing over time. It's not just awareness. For sure, awareness is helping. But it's also the fact that our businesses in this country especially, but really around the world, are changing. They're changing to be more data-oriented. They're changing to be more software-oriented. And as that happens, cyber security and risk becomes even more important in your business. So I think it will continue to change over time.
For those of you listening, I want to share one of the reasons why a committee on a board is so valuable. And I'm sure a lot of you have had some interaction with different executive groups and boards. But the reason a committee is useful is because the discussions tend to be just a little bit less curated. So when you get ushered in to meet the full board, capital B, you all know that's usually after 3 or 4 prep meetings. Your charts have been reviewed. You've gone through 10 rounds of rewrite, and they communicate exactly what you want the larger board to see. And there may be a question or two, but it is an extremely curated process. That's just the way boards work. And boards don't manage, they govern. But when you get to an audit committee or a subcommittee doing cyber, generally it's been my experience that a little bit more conversation takes place. Still curated, obviously, but it's not as much. Like my observation is that you're maybe 10 times more likely to be asked some sort of practical or follow-up questions to something you say in a committee than you would in the full board. And that's why I think there's really some value to having a little bit deeper understanding. So really good points from everybody. Hey, Mike Smith, I want to ask you if we have we have about 5 minutes here. Any comments or questions that have come in?
I haven't seen any come in yet.
As I see, there's a text here that I've got that asked a little bit of a follow-up in terms of governance and international. So we have a question here asking whether we see any differences between countries. I'm not sure which specific countries might be being referenced here, but anybody, Andy or Max or Ken, do you see any international differences in the way cyber risk is communicated?
Well, the boards I'm on 2 European boards, or 1 European, 1 Middle East, really. And I would say there is a little bit of difference, mainly because of GDPR and what that's caused. That's caused more discussion at the board level about cyber and cyber risk, from a compliance perspective. Can we be compliant with all the rules in there from a data perspective, from a security perspective? And so that's the main difference I've seen. Now, some of that's coming to the States, and of course a lot of U.S. companies are global, so they have to deal with the same issues and problems.
Well, GDPR is certainly a new set of concerns. I mean, my experience has been in the UK in particular. they can be really fussy about privacy, and the EU as well. I mean, we've seen, Andy, you probably remember 10, 15 years ago, there's some very minor slaps on the wrist to Microsoft, and then all of a sudden the EU comes along and gives them a real, they really do a couple things there to kind of rotate their tires in terms of the size of the fines. I think that's what's going to happen with GDPR, right? You'll see a couple of these fines be so meaningful that the international pressure will probably find its way to domestic operations, because we'll all freak out and say, we just don't want to take the risk of seeing a fine like that. That'd be my prediction. I think it's just going to be a financial.
No. I've seen actually in my travels, so to speak, I've seen Germany be very, very strict in as far as the privacy goes. I mean, back in I'm going to say 2008, when I worked at a German bank, what happened was someone had inadvertently sent some confidential information out, thinking that they were emailing, their own home account, but they misspelled the Hotmail. So they actually wound up getting the Polizei involved to go to this person's house and watch them purge it from the computer. So, I mean, that's pretty serious.
That must have been
Ed, if I can interrupt, we had a question come in. If you'd like to address it.
Sure, go ahead and read it.
Have you seen loss exceedance curves in the work of Hubbard Searson for quantifying cybersecurity risk the way boards quantify financial risk?
Anybody have any thoughts on that, on whether sort of just generalizing that, do you see boards using analytic models? That's pretty advanced. If somebody's doing that, then that would be that'd be probably 10 times further than I've ever seen anybody do it. But anybody ever see any kind of advanced modeling?
I'll mention one thing. I don't know these particular models, but when on the one public company I was on, where we finally convinced them to put a cybersecurity board, subcommittee on the board, the first thing that subcommittee asked the CISO was, okay, you're telling me we have all these risks in all these different areas. Quantify them for me. What's my real financial risk? I mean, they went to money right away. What's my reputation risk was a little bit of discussion, which they would have to put into money to quantify it, so that they knew which holes should be plugged first. So it was almost used like a prioritization scheme and where the money was going to go.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, I think that loss exceedance curves are fairly valuable. I'm familiar with the book that you're talking about. Actually, a friend of mine, Dan Gear, did the foreword on it. But you've also got to take into not just risk quantification, but you also need to take into account risk qualification as well, right? So there are two sides of the same coin, right? It's one thing to to quantify something, but how do you qualify it to begin with, to where it makes sense, and where it's measurable, and where it's valuable at the executive level, right?
All right. Well, I think we're probably at the point, Mike, where we've kind of taken people to the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody on behalf of our panel and all the folks listening in. Thanks so much. And Mike, if you have any closing comments, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, as Ed said, for joining our webinar. I think we had a very engaging conversation. I found it particularly interesting. And I'd like to thank all of you for your time and attention. And if you have any need for it, we do plan to make this available as a download. If you want to share it with your colleagues, please feel free to do that. Once again, thank you for joining our webinar, sponsored by TechDemocracy, on communicating cyber risk. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.